Hello, ladies and gents. So today is going to be third video in the series that we are doing on our universal materials. So this one is, in my opinion, probably the most complicated skill or material or topic that we really could cover in this particular series. And in my opinion, probably the most difficult skill and the most advanced skill that we try to teach students of English literature, at least in high school. I usually cover this at the end of 10th grade and then in much more detail in 11th grade. So I save it usually to the end as a major tool that my students can use. And that topic, of course, is the idea and the skills surrounding the use of lenses of interpretation and analysis. So in this video, we're going to talk about what are lenses of interpretation, what does that even mean, what is a lens, and what are a variety of different lenses that we could use to interpret artwork, and how do we distinguish between one lens to another, and how do we really know how to use those particular lenses accurately and adequately when we are looking at artwork. So to begin with, I want to talk about the actual definition of the term lens. Now, literally, that is the term lens is a metaphor. So what is a lens literally? Well, of course, we're thinking of a camera lens or a lens that we would look through glasses or a pince-nez or something like that. And that is, of course, what we're referencing here. It's something that is going to, as the notes here say, color how we see everything. And by doing so, could maybe clarify things that we could not see beforehand. So that's what we're thinking of here. That's what we're doing here. So the figurative meaning, the actual kind of meaning behind what a lens is when we are analyzing a piece of literature or just a piece of artwork in general is, as it says here, the process of looking at a work of art from a particular perspective or a particular worldview. Okay? So we have an object, we have a feature, as we're going to say later on, in a piece of artwork or a piece of artwork overall, and we are looking at it through a particular perspective, through a particular worldview. And therefore, or as a result of that, we are able to sort of understand the work in a different way or in a much deeper way, and therefore grasp more meaning from it. So overall, as it says here, lenses help readers understand more of the potential truth being depicted in a piece of art than may be initially observed, okay? So in the whole practice of analyzing literature and analyzing art and being able to grasp any sort of deeper meaning, deeper relevance that it might have to us, and make any other connections with it and other aspects of life, lenses are very, very useful in that endeavor, okay? Now, what we're going to see here as we go through this particular group of notes is that there are, as I have created it, there are 5 or so major groups of lenses, major types of lenses that we would use. And then within those 5, there are more specific ones. There are more specified, more, narrow lenses that we could use. Now, if you're coming at this from a different English class, or if you're looking at this even after looking at other materials, more common materials about lenses for the past, I would say, 20 or 40 years, a lot of these will seem unfamiliar to you. Because if you go to college right now, if you go to like an AP classroom in most American high schools, and you're discussing lenses, I can almost guarantee that you're going to be essentially only using about 3 different types of lenses, which we're going to talk about in here. But what I'd like to do is not focus on just those ones that we're taught in the majority of schools nowadays. And I'd like to actually make it much, much more broad, just so that more students can understand it, and so that we can also get a wider understanding of how to use different points of view. You can obviously see also that there could be an argument made that if we are just looking at a certain group of lenses or a certain number of lenses, we are by definition or just ipso facto narrowing our view a little bit too much and maybe being a little bit biased. So I want to actually make sure we get all or almost all major perspectives a chance to kind of show their light here. So the first lens that we are typically going to talk about or we're typically going to use in my classes is the sociological or historical lens. Now, in my notes, as I've shown you here, I'm giving you the major lens, what its concerns are, and then what sort of background information we need to have. And then we have a little example there, which we'll go through in detail in a minute. So what is the concern of a sociological and historical lens? It is to focus on the patterns of development and success in human and societal evolution throughout history. And it seeks to look for what truths do these reveal about the success of society, okay? So when we're looking at a particular feature in a story or a feature in literature, we're trying to see like, oh, do we catch any patterns of history here? Do we catch any relevance to the development of society here? Therefore, what background information do you need to have when you're using these sort of lenses? Well, you need to think, as it says here, of how humans evolved, how extremely early or ancient societies functioned, and what did they worry about? What did they need? What were the major elements in their lives? So you could possibly tell right off the bat there, the major issue facing students of literature when we are studying lenses. And it's simply that it requires a fair bit of background knowledge, okay? So therefore, ladies and gents, you can see, obviously, if you're going to use the sociological and historical lens, or if you want to use it to any degree of success, you need to have all of that background knowledge, which will take time. You know, if you're in a good school and you're in sort of a polymathematical series of classes where they are teaching you this sort of stuff, interdisciplinary subjects, this will be easier for you because you'll be familiar with the development of society. You'll be familiar with the history of the Indus Valley. You'll be familiar with the history of like Western civilization, Eastern civilizations, and the general patterns of human development, making this a little bit easier. But if you're not, if you're coming at this from a completely singular English literature sort of perspective, this is going to be hard for you because you need to kind of branch out and see other disciplines and how they could inform us when we use these sort of lenses. Now, an example that I'm going to use for the major 5 lenses here is a symbol that we discussed in the last video, which is the symbol of fire. How could we interpret the symbol of fire through a sociological and historical lens? Well, I've given you some possible interpretations here. Fire through this lens is symbolic of is a signifier of power and innovation and the danger to safety, okay? So fire is something that provides us power. It provides us ingenuity and innovation, okay, as it did for our ancestors in society and history. However, it is also a danger to our general safety. I mean, think wildfires and that sort of thing. So it is something that's very threatening as well. It also is something that demonstrates one society's advancement over another. If one society is able to harness the power of fire, they have the potential to dominate or at least be more advanced over against another society, okay? So you see what I just did there? I interpreted a symbol, but I interpreted only through its relevance to the truths and patterns of history. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how we use a lens. So the really simplistic way that I teach my students about what lenses really are is essentially if you take a symbol and you have all, the variety, the dozens of different meanings that symbol could carry, what lenses essentially do is filter out a specific type of meaning or a specific category of meanings. So if we're looking at the symbol of fire, as we saw last time, there's a ton of different meanings. There's way more than we even talked about in that video. But what the sociological and historical lens will do, and what all the other lenses will do, is they will look at all those meanings and they will say, wait a minute, which of those meanings carries relevance to what we see in history and what we see in society. That's a lens, essentially. So it's interpreting it through what other connections we can make to this particular subject. I hope that that's clear, because this is a really, this can be very, very confusing to some students. It's a little bit abstract. But I always tell my students, especially in 10th and 11th grade, if you can grasp this, and usually they do after about a class or two, if you grasp this, you're really at a pretty high level of English education for a high schooler. That's very impressive if you can get this at a Regents level, at an AP level, at whatever level you're at. It's very impressive if you can kind of learn the lenses and then be able to kind of keep applying them. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, within the broad category of historical and sociological lenses, there are two very popular ones that I want to also talk about within that subcategory, within that category, and that is the subcategory of a feminist lens. Okay, one of the very much more popular lenses being used either in more advanced high school classes and definitely in college as well. So what is it that we need to understand about the feminist lenses? Well, obviously you need to understand the term feminism and what feminism in all of its different forms seeks to focus on or seeks to discuss, and what it is concerned about. So in these subcategories of lenses, I've listed out some major things we need to think about when we use this particular lens, or what this lens is focused on. So the first thing it's focused on is the assessment of the equality of male and female roles in whatever it's looking at. Okay, so it will look at how a woman or women in general are being portrayed and how they are interacted with in a particular piece of artwork. So for instance, if we're reading something like, what jumps into my head is Sir Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, the history, or not history, the legends of King Arthur that were compiled by Sir Malory. Virtually all or 99% of female characters in Sir Malory's legends are relatively negative characters. So the feminist lens would look at this story, and it would immediately focus on that and say, wait a minute, what's going on there? Whereas the feminist lens, if someone using the feminist lens would look at something like Greek mythology, and it would say, wait a minute, we have a whole variety of female characters here. We have characters that are very, very noble and very, very like divine. We have characters that are very complex and almost very, very tragic, but noble. We have characters that are absolutely monstrous and vicious. So it would really like to focus on that. And I hope that also kind of clues you in that the feminist lens is not always going to be hypercritical. It's not going to immediately jump and kind of look for things to complain about, as it were, as opposed to, or as much as it's going to just look at the roles and analyze them and see what it is that it could say. So a feminist lens, and this is a little bit of a bias that a lot of my students will have, is they'll think it's always negative. It does not need to be negative at all. It can be very, very positive. Now, another thing that this lens is focusing on is the desire to question the beliefs about femininity and what it is at all. So what are the female archetypes and stereotypes being portrayed in a particular work? So this, of course, becomes very popular when we're looking at Victorian literature. Victorian literature has become infamous for its poor and kind of almost oppressive stereotypes that it has imposed on women and how women should be at the time. So a feminist, someone using a feminist lens, would have an absolute field day with pointing out, oh, look at all of the stereotypes surrounding these female characters, as opposed to, for example, how a feminist lens could look for archetypal female characters when it's looking at more grand works or more kind of broad and universal female roles. Now, it also will look to potentially celebrate classical femininity. And this is where you get kind of the breaking and the dividing factions and schools of something like feminism. Feminism, as you might know, has gone through many different waves of development, all the way, from the early 1800s and so on and so forth up until today. And some schools of feminism are very, very different than other schools. Some of them are extremely critical and will want to deny the inherent nature of anything called femininity. And we'll want to say that there is no essential nature to femininity. Some schools of feminism will say, no, there is absolutely something called the feminine. There is something archetypal about feminine qualities that is exclusive to women. And they will, these two schools or these multiple schools will have philosophical disagreements about this, and that's fine. And that's why this particular lens can be complicated, because some people using the feminist lens will look at female figures and they'll say, oh, this is a fantastic depiction of femininity. This is wonderful. Whereas some of them will look at it and say, no, this is an awful depiction of female, of female character because it's just a stereotype. It's just created by men. It's all this kind of stuff. The cliche example on this would, which I used to tell my classes, is like a figure like Wonder Woman, right? So you have a figure that's a Wonder Woman-like figure that some people using this lens will say, oh, fantastic. We have this, this gorgeous, strong, beautiful, noble figure that is a woman, and she's a protector. This is fantastic. We love this. Whereas other schools of feminism will look at this and say, oh, no, this is terrible because look at her. She's a sex symbol. She's created by men. She's really not that competent compared to someone like Superman, all this kind of stuff. So welcome to the debatable interpretations of lenses. Now, the last thing that this lens is focusing on is, or will seek to do, is be particularly critical of male influence on the female roles. So they will look at, as it says here, the influence of the patriarchy and toxic masculinity on the development of these female characters and these female roles in stories. So, the Sir Mallory example we mentioned earlier is perfect for that, because Sir Mallory, of course, is a male within a very, very patriarchal society of the medieval era, writing a very, what seems to be a somewhat sexist depiction of female in his legends. So the feminist lens will immediately pick up on that and criticize him for that. And that's just kind of what it's interested in. So it'll do that for almost all of the different works of art that it could be used to interpret. So that's the feminist lens, in brief. The Marxist lens is the other, probably most common contemporary lens that you would run into in an English classroom or a college classroom today. It also is within this umbrella of the socio-historical lens. Now, what does the Marxist lens derive from? What is it more interested in? Well, it derives, of course, as the name implies, from the philosophies and the writings of Karl Marx. Now, very controversial figure, Karl Marx. Some people love him, some people hate him. Irrespective of that, I do want my students to understand the general philosophy of Marx, even if they dramatically agree with it or dramatically disagree with it. It's good to know. And I don't, of course, as I mentioned in some of my other videos, I do not impose my beliefs on any of my students. They're free to agree or disagree with this, irrespective of what they think or what I think. So what is the Marxist lens concerned about? First thing, as it says here, is the socioeconomic causes for suffering, okay? Particularly with class struggle. So it says here, all problems can find their roots in economic or class power struggles and inequality. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a fundamental Marxist idea from Marxist philosophy, that all problems, all conflict derives from socioeconomic inequality and from some struggle between the upper and lower classes in some way, shape, or form. So when you're looking at a story and you see that, and you can catch like, oh, there's something going on here between the upper and the lower class, between someone in power versus someone who's not in power, the Marxist light bulb will start to go off, or people who like this lens will immediately kind of jump on this one. Examples abound, but my class, when we do this in 11th grade, we usually will watch a movie, that has some fairy tale roots, and my students love picking The Lion King. And so when they use the Marxist lens to interpret The Lion King, what do they focus on, of course? Well, they focus on the role of the hyenas versus the role of the lions. The lions are kind of the upper class. They, rule everything, and they kind of oppress or really don't like the hyenas, or they kind of, exclude the hyenas from their pride. And the Marxist lens could have fun with that and say, oh, look, that there's an upper class kind of group of people, oppressing or excluding a lower class group of people, which then leads to the strife between the lions and the hyenas. Maybe that's one way to interpret it. Okay. Another major thing that the Marxist lens will focus on and seek to really have us understand is the toxicity of capitalist culture and the capitalist system. So, and then of course, again, comes from Karl Marx's ideas. Karl Marx was a huge, not the only, but he was certainly a vicious critic of capitalist systems and capitalist structures during the 1800s, of course, when it was pretty bad and a pretty valid critique. The hyper-competitive, focuses on the hyper-competitive, the power-based structure of our culture creates massive inequality, fosters greed and dehumanization. The example that comes to my mind is in a movie like The Matrix, which by the way is a fantastic example of a piece of artwork that you can use a lot of different lenses to interpret it. But in that movie, we see a lot of sort of kind of anti-capitalist sort of imagery where there's these big corporations that our main character is in, and he's being kind of like oppressed by this corporation. He's being forced to do this diminutive and just dehumanizing and soulless sort of work. Everybody dresses the same, everyone does their job, they sit at their desk, they go home, they rinse and repeat, they do it again. Someone using the Marxist lens will say that is a product of capitalistic society where everyone is just being kind of fostered into this sort of cutthroat or into this sort of slavish mentality. The most recent example of this in a very successful TV series called Succession on HBO absolutely is just open to Marxist interpretation because it shows that same thing. It's this these business tycoons, these corporate tycoons rather, just absolutely going after each other viciously in the most kind of cruel, hateful, cold ways possible. Someone using the Marxist lens would look at that and say, yeah, that is the result of a capitalist system where everyone is allowed to compete and everyone is rewarded for how much better they are at competition or how much better they are at dominating other people, essentially. Okay. And as a result of this, as you can kind of see coming, the Marxist philosophy calls for or really advocates for some form of revolution and the establishment of what it would call a communist system. And it says, as it articulates here, that this capitalist culture must be overthrown and remade into a world where everyone, and unfortunately, I think the slide gets cut off here. I think it's where everyone, can live for each other and live at least equally, okay? So that's the ultimate kind of Marxist, as people say, the Marxist utopia, when we want everyone to be able to live in this classless society. We need to overthrow the oppressive ruling class. So any films where you see any stories or novels, shows you see where someone is trying to overthrow this sort of oppressive class, that is essentially something that we could interpret through a Marxist lens, okay? So that's one alternative lens. Now, okay, that was socio-historical lenses. The next of the 5 big category of lenses is just the general lens of literature, okay? Lenses of literature. Now, the concern of this particular type of lens is, as it says here, the patterns and narrations within myths and literature. What truths about these patterns do the events, symbols, or characters reveal about the whole story, okay? So this lens or these lenses are very focused on story structure, plot structure, literary devices, archetypes, all that kind of stuff. I tell my students in 10th and 11th grade that, this is probably the most familiar one to you because it's what we are essentially training you to do from the very, very beginning of English class. We really like to focus on how to interpret literature and how to interpret stories through this sort of a lens. What knowledge do you therefore need in order to use this particular lens? You need to understand, as it says, the various types of patterns of narration found in literature, what similarities can be found in certain themes and patterns of storytelling. Okay, so we're analyzing a piece of artwork through the lens of how we know how stories are created in general. Okay, now the example once again is fire. How do we interpret the elements, or the symbol rather, of fire through this lens? It is a symbol of change and dramatic tension or emotional expression in a piece of art. Okay, so you think back to any sort of mythological examples, any sort of famous films, any sort of good novels that you could think of. We see fire present at moments of intense change and particularly dramatic tension. My mind goes right to the Disney films, the classic Disney films, right? Like Sleeping Beauty, The Lion King, so on and so forth. Fire comes up as a major symbol during the highest point of tension and the highest moment of change for those particular stories. So perfect way to interpret that through a literary lens. Okay. Notice I'm not doing any subcategories with that one. I'm going to jump right over to maybe the next most common, or the third lens in our big categories of lenses, and that is the psychological lens. Okay. The major concern of psychological lenses are the truths and realities of our emotional and mental health. What truths about these realities do the events and elements of a story reveal about our emotional and mental struggles in life? Okay, so that's what we're concerned about, is the internal mental states, the internal mental realities, mental patterns that we would see played out in a story that are absolutely true and reflected in our own mental life. What knowledge do we therefore need in order to use this lens? You would need an understanding of human fears, human desires, and what produces mental and emotional health within one's self and one's relationships. You also should have a generally good understanding of dysfunction, of human dysfunction and mental dysfunction, in order to be able to use this lens efficiently. Once again, the example, if we use the element of fire, how could we interpret that symbol through a psychological lens? As it says here, it is a symbol of painful emotion or aggression. That is one kind of simplistic way we can interpret it. Okay. So you see the pattern here, by the way, ladies and gents, is that we're using one element or one symbol again, and we are extracting a variety of different meanings from it, depending on what lens we are looking at it through. Okay. Now we have two subcategories within this particular lens, this broad category of psychological lens. And the first one is the Freudian lens, another very popular lens to use. So next to the feminists and the Marxists, you're probably going to use the Freudian lens if you go into an advanced literary class nowadays. This is obviously derived from the teachings, the philosophies, and the theories of Sigmund Freud, the early 1900s psychologist, psychoanalyst, and someone who is essentially the father of psychology as we know it today. Now, Sigmund Freud's theories are essentially what you would need to understand and have a general idea of when you're utilizing this particular lens. So what is it that Freud focuses on? What are some of the things that his lens or his philosophy will allow us to understand or help us understand, and therefore seek out, or what will it seek out in literature, therefore? The first thing is childhood experiences. Sigmund Freud really, really liked to focus on the effect and the importance of our own childhood experiences on our development and on our lives. And as he says, or as it says here, he believed that it's often the source of the most trauma and dysfunction in our lives. So if you go to Sigmund Freud, or if you go to a psychologist and you say, hey, I have this, this problem, this dysfunction in my life, there's this thing that's going on. If that person that psychologist is a Freudian, if they are practicing Freudian theory, they will very much like to kind of link whatever it is that's bothering you now back to your childhood, back to something that happened to you when you were younger. Just so, when we are using this lens, we will really, really kind of want to look for any sort of childhood issues or childhood experiences that affected our characters, into the present day. The example that usually sticks in my students' heads in 11th grade when we study this is the character of Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, as we would know him popularly. A character who starts from a very, very young age, going through some relatively traumatic experiences with the loss of his mother, the loss and the potential loss of his wife and his children. So this his experiences in childhood immediately kind of, make him desire power, make him fear loss, all this sort of thing. That sort of an analysis would be the use of a Freudian lens, okay? Now, Freud will also focus on family conflict and family dysfunction, okay? So the family drama, as Freud calls it, is a major element of his theories and his ideas. And the cliche and the most classic way to understand this is with the myth of Oedipus the king. Sigmund Freud, of course, coins the idea of having an Oedipus complex. Well, that term Oedipus, that name Oedipus, comes from the Greek story of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king of Thebes. In short, the story of Oedipus is about a man who flees his home in fear of a prophecy that said he was going to marry his mother and kill his father. And in the process of fleeing his home, his supposed home, he kills a man on the side of the road in a kind of a fit of road rage, and then enters into the city of Thebes and becomes a hero and marries the recently, what do we want to call it? The recently widowed queen of the city. Unfortunately, he of course realizes later on that the man that he killed was his father, and the woman that he married and had children with was his mother. So horrifying situation that Freud basically focused on as an expression, a mythological expression of some very classic and very deep human dysfunction. At some level, Freud was like, "Oh yeah, we all really have that desire, those desires within us." But in a more sympathetic way to interpret Freud would be to say that he was warning us against our anger and our resentment towards our father as a figure who was trying to control us, and the danger of becoming too close and becoming blurring the lines with our mother too much, and of a mother who tries to kind of keep us safe and protected but ends up causing us immense harm. That is the type of dysfunction and conflict that a Freudian lens would really pick up on. So in any instance where you see a mother figure or a female figure or a parent figure that is overprotective of a child, overprotective of a character, trying to shield them from any sort of danger at all, and thereby trying to control them and trying to dominate them, trying to be tyrannical over them. Someone using a Freudian lens will jump at that and say, there you go, that is what is called an Oedipal parent, an Oedipal mother. That is a tragic sort of situation waiting to happen, okay? Now, the other major theory that Freud develops is the different categories within our psyche, the id, the ego, and the superego. And to give you a quick summary of what those are, all three of those, Freud believed that within our psyche, within our mind, within our soul, whatever term you want to use, we had these three categories: id, ego, superego. The id is, if you want, our baseline desires, are just instinctual, unfiltered, intrusive thoughts, as you would say, kind of desires that we just want to go for. Okay, it's what our monkey brain or our lizard brain tells us to go for. The ego is the conscious mind that tries to say, no, like, wait, let's actually kind of filter and make conscious choices, make kind of actual distinguished choices in what we're doing. The superego is the part of your mind, the part of your soul that kind of exists above that is telling you not necessarily just what you immediately want to do, what you consciously think that you should do, but it's kind of, or what you think that you are going to do. It's the part of your mind that tells you what you should do. It is in some sense linked to the conscience. It is an idea that it is sort of the voice in your head that is telling you, like, this is what you should go and do. This is what you ought to do, essentially. Okay. Our ideal desires, as it says there. Those particular groups and categories usually take the form in artwork of a variety of different characters. So if you have a character, for example, that is intensely focused or intensely driven by just their passions and just their immediate desires. They seem to have no filter. They seem to just be driven by, lust, anger, hunger, all this sort of thing. That would be a figure that represents the Freudian id. Okay. If you have a character that is trying to really control themselves and trying to make rational decisions and trying to act logically and trying to, really govern themselves, that is closer to this the ego. Whereas if you have a character who's sort of guiding you and kind of telling you this is what you ought to do, this is what you need to be, careful of, is sort of acting in sort of a mentorish role, it's closer to the superego. Okay. Now, of course, as you could tell from the story that I mentioned with the childhood experiences, that I mentioned with the family conflict, you can kind of tell that Freud and the Freudian lens is really, really useful when we are interpreting tragedies. And that is the last thing that Freud really brings to the table here with his interpretations. He has us focus on tragic flaws and dysfunctions. He says, in our own subconscious and past experiences lies the root of all of our flaws that will eventually destroy us and eventually bring us down. Okay. So if we have stories, or if we see stories where a character has a major flaw in their personality, in their psychology, in their soul, and they're ignoring it, and they're not really even aware of it, but we as the audience can see that that is what's going to bring about their downfall. That's going to bring about some major tragedy in their life. And it does. That is what the Freudian lens will really focus on. That is, in some sense, the Freudian story, this idea of us as human beings having these flaws within us. And because of our own fear, because of our own weakness, and because of our own laziness, just sort of ignoring them and trying to, repress them, them kind of building up and bubbling underneath our subconscious and underneath the surface of our lives. And then finally one day or over the span of however long it takes, just eroding our lives and causing more tragedy than we could imagine. That is the Freudian story. Okay, that is the Freudian warning. So when we see this happening in literature, we could say, aha, the Freudian lens, could be used right there. That is what Freud would say. This is someone repressing their trauma, repressing their tragic experiences, and not dealing with it, and then suffering the consequences afterwards. Okay, all right. So that's Freud. Now, the next one, the next kind of subcategory for the broad umbrella of psychological lenses is Carl Jung, who, by the way, was Sigmund Freud's probably his most famous student. Much different than his teacher. The Jungian lens is typically in my classes one of the most popular lenses of interpretation that students like to use. That might be in part because of its own inherent accessibility, its own inherent beauty, but it also could be because it's the one that I'm the most familiar with. If I had to pick one of the lenses that I am the most kind of familiar with, it would be the Jungian lens, because most of my teachers were teaching us kind of through this particular lens. So what is the Jungian lens? What is it that we need to understand about Carl Jung's beliefs and theories that would inform us in how to use his particular lens? Well, the first thing is that Carl Jung believed in the goal of a completed self, or a complete transfigured self. And as it says here, we are meant to develop, grow, and transform into greater, more full people, more fully mature people. So this lens really likes to look for characters who are dynamic. Someone who goes from being a boy and becomes a man, someone who goes from a girl and becomes a full woman. So classic hero stories immediately jump to mind, where we have someone start off as a squire, a farm boy, an everyman, and then becomes someone much, much more competent, capable, and impressive as a result. He focuses on the growth of a human being, or the growth of a character, through trials and transformation. So we must undergo challenges and struggles to help us develop, learn, and reshape ourselves, essentially. So when we have characters going through these trials, going through these immense periods of suffering and sacrifice, and just overwhelming suffering, we see that that is something that transforms them, that improves them, as painful as it is. The examples abound. I mean, my mind jumps, of course, to Star Wars. And we see the character of Luke Skywalker start off as this kind of whiny farm boy, and then go through a bunch of different challenges. And in the fifth episode of Star Wars, go through a serious amount of struggling and scarring, even. And then by the time we see him in the final, that particular trilogy, the episode 6, we see him as a much, much more capable and much more competent and a much more good figure as a result of what he's gone through. Now, Carl Jung, or someone using Carl Jung's lens, would focus right on that and said this person had to psychologically go through these experiences in order to really become their true integrated self. Now, the actual psychological process of transforming yourself, Carl Jung uses these particular terms down on our last point here, and as to what we need to do. And these are good terms you need to kind of understand, just to understand what it is that he's really kind of getting at, what he's saying. The term persona, the term anima and animus, and the term shadow are the main concepts within Carl Jung's ideas and the use of his lens. So first, the persona. The persona is essentially the face that we present to the external world and to the social world around us. So Carl Jung believed that all human beings have this. Whenever we are, in a crowd, whenever we are around somebody, perhaps even when we're alone, we present the world a persona, a version of ourselves that is not the completely unfiltered, authentic version of ourselves. It is someone that we want to present to the world. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is a good, to give you the full psychological lesson right here. Carl Jung is not saying that this is a bad thing. He says that it is actually something that is almost necessary for development. Like, when you're socialized, you want to kind of learn what is socially acceptable, what is socially appropriate. That is a proper use of the persona. However, the danger in a persona is when you have too much of a gap between the persona, the mask that you're showing, and your true self. And the result of that can be a couple different things. You can have a character who presents this face to the world, and that face is totally wrong. That face is completely a conscious deception. That is not really who they are. The example that my students cling on to immediately is Scar in The Lion King. Scar presents himself to Mufasa and to Simba and to Zazu as this, sly but kind of overall loving uncle. And that's fake. That's a completely false face. And he does the same thing for the rest of the movie until the end of the movie, when he finally just rips that mask off and he becomes the monstrous, vicious beast that he is. That is a dangerous kind of version of the persona. Another dangerous version of a persona that Carl Jung points out is a character who is completely putting up a persona, but thinks that that's actually them. So they're kind of giving you a false version of themselves, and they're not actually getting into they don't actually know what they're really doing, what's actually the real character that they have beneath that. So they identify too closely with their persona, and they've never actually, dropped the mask and just been authentic for a minute. I can't off the top of my head think of a character that we could use for a lens like that. Yeah, I can't think of it right at the moment. But examples abound, I'm sure, in your personal lives, or even in your own life in some sense, when you find yourself or you find someone that's really just putting up the act for too much and for too long, and they really haven't stopped and sat down and become authentic anymore. So what Jung says a character needs to do is to not present a completely detached persona, or a persona that we kind of get possessed by, but to integrate our persona. So to have our persona and our true face be almost indistinguishable. So what I tell my students is, what I try to do is show them, my persona as a teacher is not really that different than my actual true self, my true face. It's just a little bit filtered. All the swear words are filtered out, or all the jokes are kind of filtered out in some degree. But that's about it. Everything else is pretty much me. Now, That's what we need to see with characters. So characters who become more authentic, characters who become more real and more honest, and more kind of competent in social situations. These are characters that a Jungian lens would say, ah, that person is totally kind of integrated in their persona. Now, the anima and the animus is a much, much more kind of recognizable feature that a Jungian lens would pick up on. The anima is what Carl Jung said is the kind of feminine aspect or the effeminate aspect within our personality. And the animus is the more masculine aspect of our personality. So he believes that we all have those kind of masculine and feminine traits. But what Jung believed we needed to do was we needed to marry those two together. They needed to balance each other out because an abundance of one would be dysfunctional in some way, shape, or form. And the kind of cliche, kind of stereotypical way that he would articulate that, or that you could think about that, is a character that is too passive and too weak versus a character who is too aggressive and too overly active and too maybe bestial. The example that we demonstrate in class very frequently is the story of Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty and also Beauty and the Beast. So if you're looking at those stories through a Jungian lens, these two terms come up immediately in your interpretation. We have a character in Sleeping Beauty, for example, who is naive, who is young, and who is tricked into becoming essentially a very weak and very passive character in Aurora, right? She basically is trapped in sleep. She's trapped into unconsciousness. And the Jungian lens would point out, okay, that's bad, right? She needs to become a more full version of herself. What does she need to do? She needs to integrate her animus, that more masculine, that more kind of like assertive, that more aggressive, that more noble part of her personality, which symbolically takes the form of Prince Philip in the movie. So, notice the philosophical distinctions between the lenses. The feminist lens would, I'm sure, have a very different interpretation of this, whereas the Jungian lens would say, no, 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 this is a totally symbolic union that these two are making, that we need to have Aurora, become a little bit more active, become a much more imposing character in and of herself. Whereas in a story like Beauty and the Beast, you're going to have a character like the prince. I can't remember his name. The beast, the prince, who is way too possessed by his animus spirit. He's arrogant. He's bestial. He's over dominating. Can't control his impulses. He's just he's an animal. He's a beast. And then we have this character of Belle, who is very much like Prince Philip, is a perfect example of the animus. Belle is a perfect example of an integrated anima, which this prince needs to integrate into himself. He needs to kind of learn to be more gentle. He needs to get in touch with his feminine side and learn to control his aggression properly. Okay, so Jung would see that story and say that is how we would interpret that story. That is the anima and the animus coming together to create a more full person. And then the final example, another one that my students immediately understand, especially my male students, they really jump on this one real quick, is the role and the integration of the shadow. Now, a shadow, which we're going to talk about in the next video on the hero's journey and archetypes, a shadow figure in Carl Jung is the aspect of your personality that can exist within the subconscious, but is a very dark form of what over here Freud would have called the id. It's a much darker form of that. It's the part of you that has the capacity for incredibly wicked, evil, sadistic aggression and has just very, very sort of insidious qualities to it. Now, there's a very clear demonstration of Jung's philosophy, which is essentially that human beings have this incredibly dark potential inside them. Well, when we're using the Jungian lens to interpret artwork, what are we going to look for? We're going to look for characters who have that potential or who have some connection to a person who is exercising that wicked potential, but also trying to control it, that character is trying to integrate it into themselves properly. And that is what we're talking about in the Jungian lens, is a character who tries to to integrate their shadow in themselves. Some classic examples that come to my mind would be Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, a character who has this connection to the dark side, to wickedness, to evil, in the form of his father, Darth Vader. He tries to resist that temptation. He tries to resist the pull of the dark side and control his aggression, but also integrate it into himself so he can use it. He can use it and become a more disciplined and a more powerful person, a more force for good. That is a feature that Jung really likes to focus on, is that characters should not be harmless. They should not be overly weak. They need to be able to use their swords. They need to be able to use their aggression, but in a controlled way. My fans of Avatar: The Last Airbender, the series on Nickelodeon from many years ago, everyone would recognize what I'm talking about right here. If you're looking at the character of Zuko, or if the whole feature of firebending, Jungian lens could immediately jump on that and say, aha, that is the whole point of the shadow, is being able to control your aggression and be able to really integrate it into yourself. Stories like Harry Potter also have the same thing, where we have a shadow character like Lord Voldemort, literally, putting a part of himself into Harry Potter, and then Harry Potter having to, deal with that and control that in some way. So characters that are touched by their shadow, characters that need to integrate their masculine and feminine features, characters that need to really understand themselves and how to behave in the world in their persona. The Jungian lens will focus on that. Okay, so that was psychology. As you can see, very complicated, very popular, and very, very useful in interpreting artwork. Really quickly now, the philosophical lens. Another big category of lenses, probably the fourth big one we're going to use. So interpreting a piece of artwork through a philosophical interpretation. What are they concerned about? They're concerned about how the events and elements within a story reveal something about one's struggle to find goodness, wisdom, truth, and beauty. In other words, enlightenment. How are we making our way towards a greater understanding about the world and wisdom overall? What do we need to know, therefore? What is our kind of background knowledge we need to have about this particular lens in order to use it effectively? Well, we need to know about the assumptions that people make about reality itself. We need to know what is true in some sense. We need to have some understanding of truth and the value of wisdom in our lives, and what keeps us from truth, goodness, and beauty. What is it that kind of inhibits us from getting into this more full, enlightened state of being, if you want to call it that? Now, to go back to our recurring symbol that we're interpreting, if we're using fire, what could fire symbolize through a philosophical lens? Well, I think it's clearly a source of truth and enlightenment, right? We remember that from the last video, that fire and light, bring forth meanings of enlightenment, truth, and all this sort of stuff. So the philosophical lens would jump on that and say, yeah, that's absolutely what this symbol is getting at, is that it's this beautiful source of the truth about the world, okay? Now, again, we have one category, one kind of subcategory in here that I like to teach my students, and it's probably the most famous philosophical lens that you would use, and that is, of course, the Socratic lens. Socrates, the Athenian philosopher, probably one of the fathers of philosophy as we know it today in the West, taught a lot of different things and concepts that we have really integrated into our understanding of philosophy and thought today. The major three that I'm focusing on here for the use of his lens are as follows. First and foremost, he believes that we need to focus on and to understand the ultimate goal, which is what he calls the good. We need to strive for this goal, to become enlightened, to become wise, and to know and to be integrated into virtue, which is goodness, as he calls it. Virtue is right action. We need to focus on this. We need to be always striving towards that. That needs to be our summum bonum, as you would say. You need to make sure that we are fixed on the right goal. And then how do we reach that, of course? What is the method? What is the path in order to reach this? Well, he would say through growth, through exploration. Exportation. That's a misquote. It should be exploration. Learning and questioning. So anyone who's questioning, any character who is seeking to unravel a mystery, is absolutely going to be a good target for a Socratic lens, as someone who is trying to tease their way to the truth. And then what, of course, are the obstacles in our way? What is it that bars our way? Well, there's that, first of all, that basic ignorance, this deep Socratic truth, which I usually have posted on my classroom, or I rant about in class many times, which is that we are all fundamentally very, very ignorant. We need to come to grips with that. That is something that I think we should know. We should articulate much, much more frequently than we do in classrooms today, is that we are all, me, the teacher, everyone, the students, everyone that we know, are basically very ignorant. We need to kind of continuously be asking questions and be acknowledging humbly what we don't understand, instead of putting up this persona that we are actually much, much more wise and much more intelligent than we are. The Socratic lens and Socrates himself would be very much opposed to that. Opposed to us kind of pretending otherwise. So that's one thing that would bar the way to our obstacles in getting towards the truth and getting towards enlightenment. The other one, of course, would be misinterpretations. If we see something in the world, we could completely misunderstand or misinterpret what it is, what's going on within it. Inherent lies is another major one. So when we see deception in a story, when we see a character weaving lies around the plot or around other characters, this is something that the Socratic lens would really focus on. Or more accurately or more frequently, what we're going to see, if you're using a Socratic lens, you're going to be fixated on when a character is maybe lying to themselves or believing in a lie, in something that's fundamentally a lie. The best example of that is when a character is not seeking the ultimate goal and the good. They are believing in a lie. They are thinking that something else is the greatest good. So, for example, I just got done a few months ago teaching The Great Gatsby. Jay Gatsby very much has a goal and what he believes is a major good in his life. It is to recreate his past with Daisy, who is herself essentially a symbol of a very vain and kind of vapid version of an empty American dream. The Socratic lens would look at that story and say, Jay Gatsby's major error here is that he is not chasing the right goal. He is believing in a lie, the lie of the green light, right? The lie that he could recreate his past, or that he should even try to create his past. That would be something that Socrates would really fixate on and say, this person is completely veiled in ignorance and not going towards the truth. Now, the last obstacle that a Socratic lens would kind of look at as an obstacle to your goal, or the achieving your goal of enlightenment and wisdom, would be malevolence. Is your own malevolence, your own kind of propensity towards sadistic or vengeful behavior, or that of others. So that there are people out there, and also elements within yourself, that will actively try to keep you away from the truth and keep you away from goodness. And I usually throw in one particular little advanced vocab word here for my students, and that is the term of someone who is a cynic. Not someone who is cynical, but someone who is a cynic, which is a philosophical term, which means someone who does not care about the truth, someone who is just going to be completely pragmatic, or just do what they want and totally have no interest in what is actually true and good. That is something that the Socratic lens would look for. So if we see someone, again, to use the Great Gatsby example, my mind immediately goes to someone like Tom Buchanan. Tom Buchanan is just this overwhelming negative force of toxic masculinity and just shadow aggressive behavior. But the Socratic lens would focus on him as someone who is just totally irrespective of what is true. He does not care. He's going to just do whatever he needs to do to get what he wants and just satiate himself on his own ego for the rest of his life. Okay, so that's the Socratic lens. A bit more complicated, a bit more abstract. I usually only see maybe like 10% of my students using this one, but that's okay. Okay, the final lens, the religious lens. Okay, so we had our socio-historical, literary, psychological, philosophical, and then we end with the religious lens. One of the oldest lenses that we are using to this day, not as popular as some of the other ones, but is a very important one to know, particularly if you're looking at Western literature. It is concerned with how the events and the elements of a story reveal something about our relationship to God or the divine. Okay. What do we therefore need to know in order to use a religious lens? Well, we need to know what God and or the divine are like. What brings us closer to these things, okay? And what keeps us distant from these things. So that, in its most simplistic form, is what the religious lens is looking at. It's looking at, how does something in this story reflect the nature of God, the nature of, the divine, and the nature of our struggle to get closer to that, or to kind of come into communion with that. Um, the symbol, of course, of fire. How do we interpret this? Well, fire could be interpreted through a religious lens as either a spiritual power, kind of this otherworldly, ethereal power. Think of the burning bush, right? Or all the other forms of fire that are linked with God in the Bible. Or it could also be a symbol of destruction. It could be a symbol of like hell, obviously, if you're using elements of Dante, if you're using elements of Jesus's terms of hell, or if you're using like John Milton's description of hell as one great furnace with fire that gives forth no light. So it's a brilliant point by John Milton. But yeah, we have a lot of different ways we can interpret a lot of different stories through this particular lens. Now, in the more subcategory, like the easiest subcategory of the religious lens would be the Christian lens. The Christian lens I picked because it's a major and maybe the dominant religion of the world. It's certainly the dominant religion that influenced the majority of Western literature. So it's good to understand. It's good to see how this lens really fueled and influenced a lot of literature, a lot of artwork, and how we can use it to interpret a lot of things that we're reading. So what does it focus on? What are the things that the Christian lens likes to really kind of what would be the proper word? Point out in stories. The first one would be God's nature. All right. So Christianity believes that God's nature is, in its essence, love. Right. I think there's a famous passage in the book, in the Gospel of John. It says God is love. So God is essentially loving. He is essentially goodness itself. He is essentially powerful, wise, like ultimately wise, ultimately powerful, and infinitely forgiving, and providential in his planning, which means he has all things sort of planned out in his divine mind. That's God's nature. So when we see things in stories that reflect those characteristics, that reflect the characteristics of something that is overwhelmingly loving, overwhelmingly full of grace, overwhelmingly good, and deeply, deeply wise. We see sort of a reflection of the divine nature in that. A classic example, in my mind at least, is when we're analyzing like a story like Harry Potter, and we see Harry Potter in the Hogwarts castle. We see this little world that J.K. Rowling has set up, and who sits above the castle at the top of the castle, the highest chair in the room, with his very old ethereal kind of atmosphere around him, and this deeply kind of good and loving nature, and deeply wise nature that's kind of overseeing everything. Oh, that's Dumbledore, right? That's Professor Dumbledore. I think the Christian lens would look at Harry Potter and say Dumbledore is definitely being placed, at least for Harry, as sort of a god-like figure. He's sort of like a guiding figure for Harry. In that, he definitely is linked with the nature of God in some sense. Now, another thing that the Christian lens is going to really focus on, or really kind of hone in on in stories, is human nature and the human situation, or the human condition. The Christianity says essentially that we are good in our essence, that human beings are essentially good, that we are, the maximal kind of like peak of creation. We are made in the image of God, all this kind of stuff, and valuable, infinitely valuable to God. However, we are also corrupted and kind of dirtied by the nature of sin, and doomed to fall short of God's standards for goodness. So, right, we are corrupted. There's something within our nature that makes us inherently ignorant, inherently weak, inherently, cowardly, and inherently cruel. And because of this, we really are not able to live up to the divine standard of saintliness. So, but all the while still being something valuable deep down. Now, when we see this in stories, we see, for example, characters. I think of the cliche examples in love stories when you have a character who seems very unlovable or seems like someone that you shouldn't pursue romantically or you shouldn't pursue as a friend. And yet you still are. It's because you see something in that person that is much more valuable than just the inherent flaws that they have. Or maybe, it's something that is that would condemn them, and yet you love them anyways. My mind, of course, immediately goes to something like the sixth episode of Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker sees the goodness in Darth Vader and fights to save him and try to bring him to the light side of the Force, no matter what, even though he is a very, very evil character. That is something that the Christian lens will really, really fixate on and focus on. And then the final one, of course, as the name implies, of course, is we're going to look for Christ-like figures. We're going to look for Christ's, someone kind of mimicking Christ's role. And what is Christ's role in Christianity? Well, he is the savior, which means the healer, by the way. The Greek term salve doesn't just mean save. Its root actually means to heal. So we're looking for characters who are healing and saving mankind or other characters from this kind of corrupting, imprisoned kind of nature, and to bring them into a situation that is much more full of eternal love and joy. So when we see rescue, sacrifice, when we see kind of characters guiding other characters into this more, this much, much more impressive state of being, that is when we see the Christian lens at work. We see somewhat of a Christ-like figure there. I'm going to save my examples for that one for our final little discussion here. But that is essentially the Christian lens. Okay, so ladies and gents, that was a very long kind of excursus into all the different lenses that I will be talking about and that I will be teaching in my classes. If you understand them, if you are lost with them, that's totally fine. I mean, it's something that you really do need practice with, and you do need to kind of familiarize yourselves with the subject matter in order to get comfy with. So in my classes, we'll usually spend about a month or so really discussing them and really kind of picking them out in different movies and fairy tales, as we're going to see. And my students, over the span of that month, maybe a couple months after that, we'll start to get more comfortable with that. Usually on my final exams for 10th grade, I'm sorry, for 11th grade, I will ask that my students use some sort of a lens interpretation in their discussions, in their writing, for example. So yeah, it's a very, very advanced, but very, very useful tool in literature. Now, on to our final thing, which is our examples of how to use lenses. And for that example, I'm going to use the famous Disney story, the famous Grimm's fairy tale story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So, Grimm's fairy tale was written by Christian authors, possibly as a Christian allegory, as we're going to see. And it's very familiar to most of us, especially through the Disney film. This young girl is born almost miraculously, and she has a lot of inherently amazing qualities. Her beauty, her goodness. She seems to be beloved by nature inherently, and she is beset upon by a very wicked, whether depending on the version you're reading, it's a stepmother or a queen, and this woman desires to harm her, to consume her, her heart. And as a result, Snow White has to flee. She finds refuge in the company of the seven dwarves out in the forest. And then through a number of tragic means of deception, the wicked witch, I'm sorry, not the wicked witch, the evil queen, deceives her and poisons her before being punished herself. And then Snow White is miraculously saved by a prince from a neighboring kingdom, and then brought into of course, the wonderful happily ever after with him afterwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 features of that story. What I mean by a feature of a story is just anything within the story. It could be a plot point, it could be a character, it could be a symbol, it could be a color, it could be an event, whatever. We're going to look at those features, and we're going to discuss how we could maybe look at them through a number of different lenses and what they could mean, okay? We're going to do it briefly. We're not going to do it in much depth because, as you're going to see, of course, you could go into quite a bit of depth. I just want to show you generally what we're going to notice or how to utilize these lenses, okay? Some things to consider before we do this. This is just food for thought. And I usually like to discuss this a lot more in class, but, you know, good for thought. We know that Grimm's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was written by Christians and was most likely supposed to be a Christian allegory, okay? But that means that it's supposed to be a Christian story that tells us the essential truths of Christianity in the form of a fairy tale. That's why they wrote it, okay? Does this influence our choice of which lens to use? Some students will say, well, yeah, that means that we have to use the Christian lens and that's going to be the best one and we should only use the Christian lens. Some will say, no, we could use any lens and we could still get the truth of Christianity from this story, or we could get totally other truths, totally other, tangential truths like Freudian truths or like Jungian stuff. It's all there, possibly. Some will say, no, it doesn't matter at all. This is what is known as the death of the author movement in literary interpretation, that it should have no impact on you. You should just read it and then see what truth emerges out of it. Possibly. Welcome to the debate of English classes and being an English student. I will not tell you which one, but those are just some good things to think about as you are utilizing lenses. Will certain lenses be more useful in certain situations? Should you, take into account what the author intended when he or she wrote their work? Maybe, okay? Or maybe not. Now, first feature, of course, Snow White. We have an underdeveloped woman, I should say girl, underdeveloped girl, oppressed, kept ignorant or underdeveloped, sheltered, a feminine spirit, lower on the social hierarchy, inherently good and pure, but in need of growth and development. Okay, so I gave you a long description there of this feature. Or of this particular feature of the story. Can we see which of those terms certain lenses will leap onto? Well, let's see. The term underdeveloped woman immediately makes me think of Carl Jung, right? Of someone who is young in their adolescence, needs to grow up, needs to integrate more parts of themselves to become more whole. That's Carl Jung. That's the Jungian lens. She is oppressed and she is kept ignorant or underdeveloped, okay? Oppressed, kept ignorant. That kind of leads me to think of two things. Either the feminist lens, right? A woman who is in an oppressed situation, although I might push back against that a little bit because who is it that's oppressing her? It's actually a toxic female figure. It's the evil queen, right? It's this jealous, overbearing woman. So maybe not necessarily the feminist lens, but maybe a Marxist lens would work right there. Although you could say, and I have had some students who love the feminist lens focus on this and say, wait a minute, no, she is oppressed. What she's being oppressed by is a figure that symbolizes toxic femininity, a figure that is all that women should not be. So she's trying to resist that, okay? She is like a woman trying to resist the toxic traits of her own gender, maybe. She's kept ignorant, okay? That could be, again, the Freudian, right? A child who is kept too sheltered. That could be the Socratic lens, someone who is trapped in ignorance, trapped in, a world of ignorance and illusions. And she is sheltered. Now that's 100% Freudian, right? We're going to focus on children who are sheltered. A feminine spirit, that's the feminist lens, okay? Lower on the social hierarchy. Once again, that's got to be the Marxist lens. She's lower class, right? She does not have a lot of power. Inherently good and pure. Well, of course, that's the Christian part right there. That's going to be someone saying, yeah, you have this inherent goodness to you. You have this inherent beauty to your character. That's got to be the Christians. but she is in need of growth and development, right? So she still needs more. That is, of course, Carl Jung, and maybe a little bit of the Christian idea too. So you see what we just did there. We took this long description, all of them are correct, and we saw how all the different lenses will jump on this and say, aha, like those are different points that we want to focus on, okay? The next one, of course, the queen, right? The evil queen, a toxic monarch, rule of the ruling class, dysfunctional female, the source of evil and dysfunction in the narrative, tyrannically imprisoning mother, deceitful source of lies, the self-focused, sinful, and wicked character. Okay, a self-focused and sinfully wicked character. Okay. Well, once again, can we hear the voices of all those different perspectives in this description? Yeah. The toxic monarch of the ruling class. That sounds like a Marxist lens, 100%. Okay. Dysfunctional female. Could be a feminist lens, possibly. The source of evil and dysfunction in the narrative. Now, that could be a literary lens, actually. That's something we haven't heard a little bit from, that we're identifying the antagonist, right? But we could also say that that's a Jungian lens as well, right? The shadow, that's him pointing out she is the shadow. She is the source of dysfunction in Snow White's life. Tyrannically imprisoning mother. That's got to be Freud, focusing on the family dynamics right there. She's a mother who is tyrannically kind of controlling her daughter figure, and imprisoning her, not allowing her to grow up, not allowing her to develop, right? Deceitful source of lies, right? She entraps Snow White in this kingdom, or in this castle of lies, of ignorance, basically, of shelterness about the world. That's the Socratic, right? She is someone keeping you away from goodness and enlightenment. And she, of course, is self-focused. She's very envious, and she's sinful and wicked. Well, that is, of course, the Christian lens. That is someone is focusing on her as someone who is very satanic in her role as someone who's trying to really kind of take what is good about Snow White and drag it down into wickedness and into corruption. Okay. The dwarves. Okay. A humble working people, a lower class of people who know right from wrong, who live closer to the truth, men who live in an isolated community, men who desire to have a female presence in life. Okay. The dwarves. Humble working people. Sounds a little bit Marxist to me, focusing on them as a working class, right? The lower class of people, right? Knowing right from wrong. This sounds a little bit like a combination between a Marxist and a Christian lens, ironically, right? Yeah, Christianity, or the Christian lens, I should say, loves to focus on that. That every person, a humble person working a simple life could know the deep truths about morality and goodness and right and wrong very simply, right from their heart. They don't need to have the deep education that scholars would need, right? So people who live closer to the truth, right? We see that symbolically in the sense of their humble living and the fact that they're working in the earth, right? It's a reference back to our symbols last video. They are someone who work close to the earth. Now, which lens is that focusing on? That sounds like the Socratic lens, right? Or the philosophical one at very least. Men who live in an isolated community. Sounds like it's something to do with socio-historical. They're isolated in their community. Maybe you could kind of go a lot of different angles with that. Men who desire to have a female presence in their life. That sounds Jungian. That sounds like people who want to integrate some of that anima spirit into their lives. Absolutely. Okay, that's the dwarves. The apple, right? The poisoned apple. A deception given by a seemingly safe motherly figure who is in fact the source of all dysfunction in one's life, causes subjugation to an old tyranny and oppression, and ultimately causes unconsciousness and death. Okay, that is a very, very rich symbol, okay, a very rich feature of this story that every lens of interpretation is going to just leap on. Let's start real quick. We'll go through this one pretty quick. A deception given by a seemingly safe motherly figure. That's Freud. That's Freud all over the place, right? That is someone offering you something which seems very attractive, very desirable, and very appealing, right? Freud would probably say, oh, this is the temptation of you to remain, or of the character to remain childlike, childish, I should say, and weak, and get the comfort of being able to live in the Hakuna Matata sort of mom's basement world, where you don't have to worry about the world, where you don't have to solve your own problems. You can just let mommy do all that work. That is the temptation here, right? To just live as though you are under mom's thumb the whole time. Seems attractive, but is actually going to be a source of all the major dysfunction in your life. So that is what's being offered to Snow White right there, symbolically, is what Freud would jump on. He'd say, that's what that is, okay? Causes subjugation to an old tyranny and oppression. Okay, that's Karl Marx. That's Karl Marx, and maybe even the feminist lens. There is this temptation to go back into the, as Marx would say, the luxury, the bourgeois lifestyle, to just kind of allow yourself to grow fat on the riches of capitalism, as opposed to try to fight that kind of toxic system. To just let yourself keep getting rich all the while, making the rest of people suffer in some way. Keep that subjugation going. That's the temptation there. Okay. It's also a possible temptation with feminism, right? The temptation to just remain ignorant of the influence of the patriarchy on you, remain ignorant of your oppressive state, and just kind of live, unconscious as you are about all of that. And like I said, also causes unconsciousness and death. Well, the unconsciousness and death thing, that kind of makes me think of probably a little bit of Jung, a little bit of Socrates, and a little bit of a lot of Christianity at the end there. So this, the cause of doing this brings you unconsciousness. It makes you lose your free will. It makes you lose your awareness, your humanity in some sense. It plunges you into, as it does in the story, a deep sleep, which is usually symbolic of someone who is not at the height of their capabilities. It is someone who is stupefied in some sense. It's bad. It's someone who's plugged into the matrix, right? The death aspect of it, of course, that's Christianity all day long. That's someone saying that you are robbed of life, of eternal life, of qualitative life, not just biological life. You're being shrunk at a level of your soul. That's what's being kind of depicted in this this symbol. So very rich, very, very rich symbol. And then of course the prince and the rescue of the prince, right? What could this mean? It's described as a more functioning monarchical male figure that comes from a higher world to help the female in distress, lifting her out of unconsciousness and death and bringing her to a better world or fate. Very, very rich symbol there too. Okay, let's start right here. A more functioning monarchical male figure. That's going to be the Marxist and the feminist lens, jumping all over the place. Now, I would love to have a class full of Marxist and feminist students and interpreters, and then drop that statement and see what they did with that. Because I guarantee you that some of them will not be comfortable with this. They will say, no, this is bad. This is still bad, right? He's a monarch. We don't want this. He's a symbol of that kind of oppressive, upper class. Some of the Marxists might say, yeah, okay, well, he's not as dysfunctional as the other one. So it's kind of a progress away from, really dysfunctional monarch, more functioning monarch, then to democracy, then to communism. Like, we're kind of making some progress here, maybe. He's a male figure. He's a more functioning male figure. Why does she need to be rescued by a male? Some of the feminists will say. Some of the feminists will say, no, this is like, just like Carl Jung would say, this is like her getting into a better relationship as opposed to one with her, toxic mother figure. This is her getting into a more functioning romantic situation, growing up, becoming more mature. Okay. A figure that comes from a higher world to help the female in distress. Okay, coming from the higher world, or that could mean a higher world religiously speaking. That could be a spiritually higher world, like the prince is probably a symbol of Christ in Christianity through the Christian lens. Or the prince could be just a symbol of the animus that is being integrated in the Jungian lens. He's kind of like a higher level of consciousness coming down and bringing you up to a higher level of development. Lifting her out of unconsciousness and death, right? That's what I just said. That's basically that whole idea, okay? And bringing her to a better world and fate, right? So we are having the happy ending where we are going away somewhere better overall. Now, the shining city on the hill got to make you think of Christianity. I mean, that's like going to heaven. That's the bridegroom and the bride, kind of the marriage of heaven and earth is what's being depicted there. That is what Grimm initially intended, the brothers Grimm initially intended. But it works also in a Socratic lens. It works as going towards enlightenment. It works in a Jungian lens. It's going towards complete kind of fulfillment of a human being, right, in a relationship. It works, I don't know how, it doesn't work entirely as a Freudian one. It might be like, because again, Freud focuses more on tragedy, but it's kind of getting out of a dysfunctional situation. Freud would like this. It works with the feminist lens. It works as, her going into, again, a more functional, a more maybe egalitarian situation where she's not being oppressed, where everyone is a bit more respectful of her and other people around them. It also works a little bit on the Marxist lens too, right? It's a more functioning society, not one where we're going to have, people that are effectively oppressed and enslaved. Okay. So, ladies and gents, what was it then? Was it a story about the oppression of women? Was it a story about the tyranny of monarchy? Was it about the need for maturity, the dysfunction of mothers, the journey towards enlightenment, or the salvation of the human soul? That is the beauty of looking at literature, looking at art through a variety of different lenses. It could be all of them. It could be one of them more than the other ones. It could be, there could be some that work better than others. You might have sensed that some of them work better than others. That's fine. So what we should be comfortable with doing, guys and gals, is looking at a story, looking at a piece of artwork, being able to say, okay, here's a feature, here's a feature, here's a feature, here's a feature of the story. And being able to see how we could look at that through one of these perspectives, or at least tease out some more truth from the story based on those perspectives, okay? Doing that will just deepen your comprehension of art, of life, and further your education overall. So very, very useful tool overall. Now, I will see you in the next video where we will cover, I believe it is the hero's journey, really focusing on kind of some more Jungian understanding and also just the general patterns of a journey narrative. And I'll see you then. Bye.